Today we're going to talk about our latest build, which is a 1992 964 Carrera 2. I'm going to cover, as usual, a little bit of the insight into the aesthetics of the car, and then also we'll talk about some of the performance upgrades that we've undertaken, just to give you kind of an idea of kinds of decisions that we take with the builds that we do. This car is destined for Dubai. Very sad to, in fact, see this car leave. One of the most pleasant driving cars that I think we've built in a long time, which we'll get into in a second. So let's talk aesthetics first. Yes, the car has got one of our bespoke, let's call them greys. This car presents as a slightly richer grey than some of the cars that you may have seen. What's interesting about all of our colours, in fact, is that they respond so much to the ambient light around them. So it's now kind of looking fairly dark grey. Well, for reference, there is a 50-year 911, 991 in fact. So this car's obviously a lot richer, and you can see starts to kind of have a slight touch of almost kind of green in there. We choose our colors extremely carefully. We take it very seriously. I think it's something which, if you get right, it's wonderful. And it's something which we do very carefully. We also discuss how we choose our colors in another video if you're interested. But as a quick recap, we in fact choose them by working backwards from the leather or the interior spec. So we're quite partial to tan or certain tan colors, and the relationship between the external colors, the blacks that are obviously apparent in all cars given trim, tires, etc., and then the internal leather color is a critical combination, which we are always very keen to kind of get right. So we actually work from the inside of the car out and then determine what our colors will be, and from that we have a fairly special palette which we use. So that's the aesthetics of the car. We'll talk about the interior in a second. Let's talk about the fundamental approach first, which is the 964s are truly amazing cars to drive. For those that aren't that familiar with them, fundamentally the design of the 911 is still very much inside or built into the 964. So from 65, which is kind of when you saw the first of the 911s coming out, all the way through to 1988, this shape of this iconic shape of the 911 remains totally unchanged. The window size, the doors, the cabin proportions and so on remain totally and utterly unchanged from 1965. But what the Porsche engineers managed to do over the course of, well, just under 30 years of fundamentally one core base model is just cram better and better technology into them. So they stuck with a really good recipe, but they improved that recipe as they went. And the absolute kind of pinnacle result of all of that is in fact the 964. I believe the 993, yes, while still water-cooled, obviously the dimensions and the proportions, air-cooled, still air-cooled, although initially designed to be water-cooled. The 993 has a different set of proportions. Personally, I prefer the 964 over the 993, but again, we're all allowed to have our respective preferences. So what you've got with the 964 is you've got the kind of the pinnacle of technology that sits within that classic, iconic 911 shape. And that's what I like about it. It's extremely drivable, very easy to drive. It's like a new car, a contemporary car, but wrapped up in a kind of a classic package. And that is what makes them, in my view, really very special. And they are, so difficult to find in their original shape because they've become so popular for backdating, which is a trend which I really do hope kind of dies out fairly soon. I don't count all of the builders into that kind of view. Some guys, the likes of Singer, for example, to me aren't a backdating company. They build fundamentally new cars. They add so much to the car that it has an identity and a quality all of its own. But so many people take these wonderful 964s, hack them apart, bolt on the wrong bumpers just to make them look a little bit older, and they remove their soul. And when I say that, I'm quite honestly, what I mean is that a 964 is a 964. If you now change it into something else, then it's nothing. It's a fake. So my view is if you want an early car, then buy an early car. So one way of looking at it is that backdates. The only reason to buy a backdate is because you can't afford an early car. But still, nonetheless, A better view is that the 964 is an amazing shape. It has a period in the 911 kind of history from an aesthetic point of view that on a daily basis is getting more and more attention. And because there's so few of them, they're also growing massively in value. So please stop backdating if you possibly can avoid it, is my view. Okay, let's get on to the interesting things about the 964, which is the first kind of thing, as I mentioned earlier. They are incredibly easy to drive, and there's all this technology in them. That means two things. They've got a lot heavier, and they have this solidity to them in terms of when you drive them that almost belies their performance. So they in fact are relatively quick, but because they are quite heavy and so planted and so solid, because of how they've kind of been improved over the course of time, you don't tend to get the sense of or feel of the very early 911s out of a 964. And you know, that is, if I was to be asked kind of by anybody, that is the only thing that I would say kind of is a criticism broadly of a 964. It doesn't feel or drive like the early cars. It is a lot heavier, and it's been designed so well that it doesn't have these kind of these little foibles that the early cars have got, where you got to kind of hold onto the steering wheel really hard and you can't text your wife at 150 miles an hour. However, what we then do is we take the 964 and we have to now kind of give it its best possible driving feel. And how we do that is a factor of two things. Okay, so the cars are designed, and all of them in fact, before any form of modification, drive extremely solidly. Now, what we now need to do is make those cars feel lighter, feel them more kind of make them feel more live and more responsive, and kind of connect them not more to the road in terms of kind of solidity, but in fact give them more of a feel when you drive them like the early cars have. And how we do that is in two ways, and I'll go through those right now. The first thing is we attempt to remove weight where it's reasonable, and weight has a massive impact on how a car feels. Where the weight is removed has a massive impact on how the car feels. So what we'll tend to do is try and take out some weights with some of our cars with carbon bonnets. Not as a standard, but we do. So carbon is one of the upgrades which we often recommend. So we lose a little bit of weight there. We also will kind of recommend that if you can, get a slightly lighter wheel where possible. The lightness of a wheel will impact on how a car feels and will impact on pure acceleration. These wheels happen to be OEM cup wheels by Porsche. What we do is we put them on a 3-axis lathe, and we've designed a specific profile for them that obviously mimics the Fuchs pattern. And I guess interestingly enough, you'll start to see a fairly kind of strong similarity with the likes of the 991. We were doing this just before the 991 or the 50 year was launched, so I can comfortably say we certainly weren't copying the 50 year. But what we are doing is effectively copying the Fuchs, where we're putting a Fuchs pedal onto a cup wheel. There are two types of cup wheels. There's a cup 1, which we've done this to, and then there's a cup 2, which is significantly lighter. The point is to take a bit of weight off that wheel, we give it a slightly unique, slightly more classic look, and you lose some weight in the right places. So another thing which we do to lose weight, and remember this is purely in terms of making the car feel lighter, or rather making the car lighter to kind of make it a bit more lithe, is our carbon seats. So this is a specific spec for this car. These are carbon buckets. They are custom made by craftsmen in South Africa. Our interior, we have an interior specialist. The seats themselves, even the foam is poured, let alone obviously the leather is cut and punched and so on. But you know, we're very kind of proud of the level of detail which we're able to kind of achieve with these seats, and they are significantly lighter than stock 964 seats, and especially those that have got a lot of motors kind of built into them. In this car specifically, we've gone with RS door cards, so we take a bit of weight out there as well. And there's a pattern there which, you know, we spent a lot of time which we feel works quite well. And what you may also notice is that in the rear of the car, there's also been a delete, there we go, of the rear upright seats. And the reason we've done that is there's very limited access to the rear of a car once you put in racing seats. They do not fold forward, they do slide forward, but getting into the back is going to be somewhat of a challenge. So we've kind of saved a little bit of weight there. The odd passenger can get in and strap themselves in. So we lose a bit of weight with carbon seats. We lose a bit of weight with some carbon components. There's obviously more that we can do, but we don't want to take it too far where we don't have to. And we lose a bit of weight down here on the wheels. And obviously the net result of that is that the car will feel slightly more, let's call it agile, because of, let's call it, I don't know, 50, 80, probably at most 80, 95 kilograms lost, and that's at a push in terms of actual weight. But obviously the weight in the wheels, when you remove that, that is an entirely different effect. The other way to kind of make these cars feel a little bit kind of more perky is obviously with performance upgrades. Now, this is one of my pet subjects. The best way to get performance upgrades, everyone seems to think, is just purely by way of throwing more power at these cars. And my view is that that is a very blunt tool to use in trying to get a car to perform better. The best tools to use, in my opinion, are the likes of gearing and weight. So you drop the weight in strategic places. This is one example of how we've dropped the weight, but gearing is a very important example. So before you kind of take a 3.6 litre motor that was designed by very, very intelligent people to run forever, before you whip it apart and try and just push a whole lot more capacity into it, rather have a look at the likes of gearing, airflow, and various, let's call it, transmission upgrades. First thing is, what we have in this car is, one, we have a short shift. The short shift shifter just gives you slightly faster response, and it's just so much fun to drive. That's the mechanism underneath, effectively, the stalk there. We also have a lightweight flywheel and clutch assembly, which is the pressure plate, the flywheel, and there are one or two other components in that RS setup. A lighter flywheel means that the engine gains revs a little bit more quickly. It doesn't affect you positively for top speed. It doesn't take anything away, but you're not going to gain anything, but it definitely gets you off the mark a lot quicker and makes the car feel a lot lighter. It's an critical upgrade in my view for the Carrera 4s. For the Carrera 2s, it's a really nice to have. So, short shift gearbox, lightweight flywheel and clutch, connected to a motor that's then got more breathing. We put more air through the motor. Look, we rebuild all of our motors from scratch. Every single motor we do gets taken apart fully and rebuilt. In certain cases, the likes of our G series, yes, we will increase the likes of compression and possibly even total displacement. But for the 964s, I'm quite loath to do that. It's just not kind of the thing which we tend to do. So we rebuild them in terms of stock compression and stock displacement. We leave the 3.6 displacement in place. But what we do is we get a bit more air through them. And there are a few other little kind of tips and tricks which I'm not going to kind of give away fully. This car happens to have, which is going to be difficult for me to show, I don't think I can, she has a 964 Cup racing exhaust system. So she's a little bit more throaty, and it's an OEM part that we happen to source something from one of the specialists that we work with. So she gets a little bit more air through her. That motor pushes out the same amount of power that a stock 964 will push out, but it then hits the car a lot more quickly through a lightweight flywheel and clutch, and obviously you can then change gears using that short shift. But the most critical thing for this car specifically has in fact been the gearing change. So what we've put into it is we've changed the third and fourth gears. So she carries in fact, well, the G50 box everybody's very familiar with, an amazing gearbox. But what we've done is we've changed the ratios for third and fourth. We are using OEM Porsche parts. They in fact come from specific 993 models. And what we're then able to do is kind of get the optimum rev range for the car in third and fourth, which is where you spend the majority of your time driving when you're in traffic and when you're having a bit of fun. Fifth is for cruising at high speed, highway use and so on. First and second is for getting off the mark. We can drop those gears, but then you just tend to be changing gears a hell of a lot. Once you're in third is where you're overtaking other traffic. Fourth is where you're kind of, third and fourth is where you spend your time. And it's there where in fact we have made the most important change. This car drives incredibly well because the revs stay at that sweet spot range of 4 to 4.5 to 5,500 revs, which, given the makeup of the 964 motor, how the cams are shaped and where the kind of the peak torque curve and power curve sits, that's where you want the revs to be. So we do a lot of work trying to perfectly identify that great perfect ratio. And I think we've got it. So how she drives? Well, what I'm going to do is we'll do a little bit of, which we've never really done before, a bit of a drive through, and I'll give you an idea of kind of in the cabin what that feels like. Let's give that a go. Right. So the first thing you notice when getting into the car is the very snug fit of our racing seats. So what it does is it gives you very little lateral movement. They also are extremely comfortable, in as much as the rake is just perfect. So you've got a great setup in terms of your legs, where they should be in relation to the pedals, as well as your obviously arms and hands. But the most important thing is no lateral movement means that you get a full kind of feel of how the car is behaving. And in racing terms, it's an extremely important principle to try and adhere to, which is you got to feel what the car is doing, and that kind of degree of responsiveness, or kind of, let's call it feedback from the car, allows you to kind of control the car better. So if one of the objectives that we have is to kind of make the car feel better, feel faster, that kind of connection is key. So these seats definitely provide that type of input. Okay, let's get it going. We'll soon need to close the window, but you'll probably struggle a little bit to hear the sound. So what we're going to do is get it going, and I'll talk then about the slightly lightweight flywheel. So we're going to give ourselves a bit of room. Key thing here is that gearing in first and second is normal. She gains her revs much quicker than normal because of the lightweight flywheel. So we're able to move off the mark quite quickly, and that is really what you get as the initial or primary benefit of a lighter flywheel. So the components within a clutch which save that weight, there's the flywheel and there's the pressure plate. In the G series, the pressure plate is the most important aspect to change. In the 964, the flywheel is really the more important component, but you can change both. If you go too light on the flywheel, don't think that you're going to now start winning races. What you'll start doing is making the car quite difficult to drive, because the rotating mass that you need within the flywheel makes the car a little bit easier to keep running. So it'll start stalling on you, it'll hunt to find the revs, and of course what speeds up really quickly will also slow down really quickly. So there's certain downsides to a flywheel that's too light. So we work quite hard on getting that balance right. Okay, so let's just get ourselves around this corner. The car itself has a wonderful connectedness feel to it, which obviously you can't really feel through the video, but I can feel. You'll also perhaps notice that there's no rattles. This is one of the most solid builds that I think Porsche ever put out. There's only so much inside the car. There's only so many things that can rattle. None of them rattle, and everything is kind of where it should be. Okay, so now let's talk about the gearing. We're now doing around 50 miles an hour, 55 miles an hour, and I'm in fourth gear. So that gear is certainly tighter. In other words, the motor is spinning faster in fourth than it normally would at these revs. So if I go to third, I can gain speed really quickly. So now we're up to 60, we're now heading up to 70, we're up to 80 miles an hour. I'm into fourth. I'm now at 5,000 revs, which is that beautiful sweet spot for this 964 given the cams. You can feel that in fourth I can accelerate, decelerate beautifully. And it's that specific range where we believe all the driving pleasure is felt. Well, not all of it, but a very significant proportion of it is felt. It's where you tend to do the overtaking, depending on obviously which kind of road you're on at the time. It's where you will, in traffic, kind of be weaving in and out. You won't be on the highway cruising in third or fourth. We keep fifth gear for that reason in its normal kind of ratio. But the third, fourth, so now we're in second, third. Now the difference between second and third is still very clear, but we can keep those revs now at 4,000 revs, and if I want to speed up, I speed up, can't slow down, slow down. And there we are sitting at between 4,000 and 5,000 revs. It is an incredibly important, in my opinion, upgrade to 964s. It's an extremely expensive upgrade, so just to warn you, there are certain custom manufacturers of gears. You can make a gear up to any ratio that you want. We prefer to use existing Porsche only components, so we tend to pay a little bit more, but in my opinion it's well worthwhile. So let's quickly test it out on this car that we're about to overtake. 3,500 revs, I'm in third, and I overtake. No problem. We're still speeding up, we're now at 5,500 revs, we're into fourth. Ah, it's wonderful! It's amazing. And into fifth. Here we are cruising. I'm now 3,000 revs. We're doing around 80 miles an hour, and we can cruise all day to obviously any speed that you're prepared to pay the fine for, which is what we need. So I hope I've covered all the main points. One or two other little kind of tiny aesthetic things which I forgot to mention. We've got a Momo Prototipo steering wheel in there. The nice thing about that is, well, it's a simple design, which we quite like. Less is always more for us, but the actual dimension of the wheel gives you a little bit more of a kind of a lithe feel in the car, much like the short shift gearing. It does not make the car faster, but it gives you a lot more feedback, and that to us is absolutely critical. So thank you very much. I hope that's helped any of you that are particularly interested or passionate about these cars, give you a bit of an insight into how we do what we do. This car I'm extremely proud of, and the client who I've become very good friends with in Dubai is looking forward to receiving her. And yeah, thanks very much for watching, and we'll soon be sharing a few more videos of a few more of our builds. Thank you.